All right, good morning everyone. 皆様こんにちは。本日はアメリカ大使館主催の英語教授法オンライン研修にご参加いただきありがとうございます。My name is Grace Choi and I'm an American diplomat at the U.S. Embassy Tokyo working on education and exchanges. I'd like to welcome you to today's teacher training session with Jenny Selvidge, titled How to Integrate Speaking into Your Lesson Planning. Jenny is joining us today from Kansas City, Missouri in the United States. She's a TESOL expert and served as the State Department and U.S. Embassy Tokyo sponsored English language fellow from July 2019 to March 2020, and was embedded in the Tokyo Metropolitan Board of Education. While here, she provided training to Japanese teachers of English and JET teachers. She's currently teaching ESL classes at Kansas University. Under the circumstances caused by COVID-19, the U.S. Embassy Tokyo will be providing virtual teacher training seminars through this series by covering various topics in TESOL. I hope you will find this online teacher training series useful in your teaching and that you will join us in many upcoming sessions in the future. I hope you learn a lot and enjoy today's session. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's to me. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday morning to be with us. And I hope that you will find something useful. I know that there's a variety of people watching this, people who have been teachers for a long time or brand new teachers, elementary, junior high, high school, maybe some college. So even with the many diverse people that are watching, I hope that you will find something useful that you can use in your teaching. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I need to share my screen, Tomoko. Okay, so we'll try it this way. Okay, so if we could go to the next slide. And again. Okay, so we're going to focus on how to integrate speaking tasks into our lesson planning, including how to correct mistakes. And also, I hope to give you lots of good ideas for some strategies that you can use in your classes. Okay, next. Today's topics, we're going to talk about your role as the teacher, the importance of four-skill integration, choosing a speaking objective, when and how to correct, when and how to assess, and then the speaking strategies and activities that I'll give you. Okay. Next. So as I've talked about in other webinars, if you've been with me before, you know that our role as a teacher has to shift a little bit from the one who gives information to a facilitator. So your role is really in that lesson design and providing opportunities for students to engage, speak, interact authentically with your topic. So you need to be ready with your lesson plan and have it well thought out, but you also need to be ready to be flexible because this is student-centered. So based on what your students do in class and how well they perform, you need to be flexible and ready to change your plan. So you have to think and plan ahead of time, but be ready to change, which is not always easy. Okay, next. So this needs to be integrated. Our goal in general in any English class is to integrate all four skills. So reading, writing, listening, and speaking need to flow together in and out. If you were in my previous webinar about grammar, we talked about the four strands that should be in every class that have input and output. And so speaking is part of that output that we need to think about. And as you plan your lesson, ask yourself these questions. The first one. What do students need from me to understand the skill or topic? So what input do they need? So this depends on what they already know. It could change from one class to the other if you have two of the same class. It depends on who is sitting in front of you. And so first ask yourself, what do they need from me? And then ask yourself, next, what tasks can I plan? Can I create opportunities for students to engage in the topic in writing and in speaking? So those output activities. So ask yourself those things. Next. So Speaking should be a natural part of the ebb and flow of your lesson plan. It should not be an isolated skill that you say, okay, now we're going to speak. It should be in and out of your lesson plan. Okay, next. So if you have been with me before, you know that I am very serious about the objectives that you choose being very crucial to the success of your lesson planning. So it's the foundation. So if you choose the wrong objective or too easy, too hard, it could ripple and have an effect on your lesson. So we have to really think about what we're asking our students to do. Next slide. So what you ask is critically important. You could have the best speaking activities. You could have really engaging activities and really have done well to get them interacting. But if the objective is too difficult, then it doesn't matter. It's not going to be successful and they won't learn. So if you choose one that's too difficult, your students will struggle unnecessarily. And it's a little harsh to say they will not be successful, but they may not be successful. And then they may lose motivation. So people always ask me, how do you motivate your students? One thing to think about is how you don't motivate your students and how you can cause demotivation. And that is something that has to do with your planning and your objective. So that's something to really think about when you're planning your lesson. Okay, next. So again, you have to know your students. And that's why in the Q&As, when people ask me, sometimes I say it depends, because it really depends on who's in front of you. So are your students anxious or confident? Are they shy or talkative? Or maybe you have a group of students that are all of those things. So you have to know who's in front of you. And then, next, start small. Don't expect too much too soon. I know that there is a great deal of pressure on you as teachers to add speaking, right? It's something that is impressed upon you all to do. But don't get ahead of yourself. Start small and don't expect too much. So slowly incorporate these speaking tasks into your lesson. So the 4 strands, it may be a little imbalanced. Maybe at first you don't have a lot of speaking, but you need to meet students where they are and slowly add it in, because we want to prioritize student success. So if you give them too much speaking to do and they're shy and nervous and afraid of making a mistake, it's going to hinder their progress. So start small. Next. So one thing that I like to do is to use the global scale of English. And I was going to show you this, but you'll have to look at it on your own. So if you've been with me before, you have heard me talk about the global scale of English called the GSE. So what it is it's a list of objectives that are categorized by CEFR level. So this way you can know if someone's at a low A1, what kind of objectives that they need, all the way to high A1 and then into the other bands, A2, B1, B2. So I've given 2 links here. It's the same thing. One is a hard copy, and the second one is an online tool. And I used this tool when I prepared this webinar. So when you want to find an objective, you can use this online tool and find exactly what you're looking for. It's really important not only to choose your objective, but this GSE gives you kind of a roadmap. So you say, okay, I'm going to choose this objective. But now I know that when my students are done with that, I know what is a little bit harder, so I know where to go next. So I really encourage you to take a look at the global scale of English when you think about your planning. And if you're planning for a whole department, so maybe you're a high school English lead teacher, you can use that for your whole planning. So check that out. Okay, next. So let's talk about correction. So this is really a difficult thing because it depends on your students. So there is not one thing that you always can do with all students. It depends on your students. So the next slide gives us our goal. So we really want to impress on our students that our goal is communication and not perfection. So when I was in Japan, I saw so many students afraid to speak because they knew that they would make mistakes. They need to know that that is okay and normal and part of the learning process. And so if we can just foster this sense of it's okay to make mistakes as long as you try to communicate, I think that's a good place to start. Next. So why do we correct at all? Grammar doesn't improve if students don't notice their errors or mistakes, spoken grammar. So they need to notice, and subtle, so not harsh correction, but subtle correction helps them to notice those mistakes. Okay, next. So we first have to think about when should you not correct students. So when you will embarrass the student is definitely not a time to correct. And that depends on some students, right? Because you've had students who are fearless, right? And it doesn't matter, and they love correction. Others, if you correct them, it demotivates them. So you have to think about student to student. If a student is obviously struggling, don't correct them in front of other people. Take them to the side or whisper to the side when no one's listening and correct them privately. Okay, so let's go to the next slide and talk about the difference between errors and mistakes, because this is important for us as teachers and when and how we correct. So the first one, an error, it occurs when the student doesn't know the answer. So next, what we need to do as teachers, we need to go back and be flexible and say, okay, we need to go back and reteach. The student still doesn't know, and so I need to go back and explain it again in a different way so that they can understand. Mistakes occur when the student knows the answer but still makes a mistake. And this is so common in speaking because they don't have thinking time. So when a student writes, there is time between when they're thinking about it, when they're writing. They can go back, they can change the writing. But when you're speaking, think about everything that they have to think about. They have to think about grammar in the moment. They have to think about vocabulary. They have to be listening to what people are saying and thinking about what am I going to say. That's a lot to do if they're not comfortable yet with speaking. So this is why mistakes happen. So in this case, they know the answer, they just didn't say the right answer. So the teacher could give them more wait time or can give them that subtle correction, and then they'll say, oh yeah, I know the answer, which happens a lot. Next. Okay, so when to correct. When focusing on a specific form. So let's say you're talking about in versus on. So in that case, when students are speaking, you don't need to correct verb tenses or other things. You are just listening for the mistakes with in and on. So a specific form. Or when errors cause misunderstanding. So if you can't understand what they're saying because of their errors, that's when you need to say, okay, let's maybe work on that a little bit. Or when a student asks for your help. Some students are eager to know what they did wrong. And so when a student asks, certainly let them know. Next. Okay, so let's talk about how to correct. So these are all considered to be subtle types of correction. Number one is the most subtle, and then number three is the least subtle. So let's talk about each one. The first one, recast, the next slide. So recasting is simply restating what the student said, but with the correction. So for example, my mother played the piano. Your mother plays the piano. So notice the student didn't have the S, and the teacher said it with the S form of the verb. And then maybe the teacher asked the whole class, what does his mother play? She plays the piano. And so you're trying to get everyone to say with the S. So this is done in whole group, briefly, without much attention. You're not really stopping for very long. You're just kind of with the flow of it. I do this a lot. I recast a lot. So this is probably my go-to form of correction. Let's talk about the next one, the clarifying question. There's two types of questions that you can ask here. So the first one is just a specific question. So I go to the park yesterday. What did you do? I went to the park. So you're just giving them that extra time. Number 2 is the one I use almost all the time. You pretend like you didn't hear it. I go to the park yesterday. Sorry, what did you say? I didn't hear you. I went to the park. Again, you're giving them that extra time. Next click. So if they don't self-correct, maybe they don't notice, that's when you maybe need to stop and do a little bit of thinking as a teacher and think, okay, are they making an error or are they making a mistake? Do they know the right answer or are they just, they don't have enough time? If it is an error, this subtle correction isn't going to be useful. So how do you know if a student is making an error or a mistake? So this has some nuance where you need to really just pay attention to the cues that the student is giving you. So if it is an error, maybe they're pretty confident. Yeah, I go to the park yesterday. They don't know that they've made a mistake. If it's a mistake, they say, I went. You tell that they have it, that they know it. So a lot of it is just getting to know your students and being able to tell the difference between an error and a mistake. All right, next. The third one is negotiating meaning. This is the most obvious one. So back to our scenario. I go to the park yesterday. Yesterday, right? In the past? Yes, in the past. Did you mean the past tense of the verb went? Oh yes, went. Can you say that sentence again? I went to the park yesterday. Good job. So you see it's a lot more explicit that you're really pointing out past tense, you're really negotiating what's going on with the student. So next click. This is best to do one-on-one, not whole group or in a small group, because you don't want to embarrass the student because you are really asking them specific questions that maybe they Next. All right, so for a Japanese context, I would really urge you to be very careful about how and when you choose to correct. So an alternative approach would be to listen for those errors and mistakes and kind of make a mental note to yourself of what's happening. And then you could address the whole class and tell them what you were hearing. So if you really think that subtle correction is still too much for my students because they're so nervous to speak, then maybe just speak to the whole group and don't single anyone out. So it's up to you what you think is most comfortable for you and your students and what will help them to encourage them and not discourage them. Okay, next. So I want to give you an example from my class that happened just this week. It happened on Thursday. So most of my class is done on Zoom. And so the task was for them to interview a partner. They were in a breakout room, just 2 people, and they had to interview them with general getting to know you questions. And then after that, they had to introduce their partner to someone else using the simple present tense. So next click. This is what I heard. These are 2 examples. What you like about Kansas City. So they forgot what do you like about Kansas City. I also heard he play baseball instead of he plays baseball. So this is what I chose to do. The next click. So it was different depending on the student because I've already gotten to know my students well enough to know what's okay with some and not others. So with a confident student, I asked him directly when he said he played baseball, what does he do? And then he plays baseball, and he kind of stuttered, but he finally got to it. Then with less confident students, I had the mental note, and when we all came back together, I said to everyone, I'm still hearing some missing helping verbs in your question. Let's review that structure, and then we go through it all together, because I didn't want to single out that one student. So you really do have to be a little bit of a detective and to kind of see which students can handle what. Okay, next. So subtle correction helps students notice their mistakes without really interrupting the flow of speech and the flow of class and without embarrassing them. But you have to do it strategically, knowing how timid some of your students might be about speaking. Okay, so let's move on to Assessment. So assessment is different than correction. So assessment is when you are assigning a grade. So let's go to the next slide. So you assess when there's an objective that needs to be measured. So I went to that online GSE toolkit to find an A1 task because someone in a previous webinar asked specifically for A1 speaking tasks. So this is one of them. Can say what the weather is like using basic phrases. So I start with my objective, and then I need to create a plan to show whether the student has mastered this objective. Okay, next. So I need to determine how I'm going to do it. What's the mode of delivery? And when will I give the assessment? So will the student do it in person and I give them a grade in the moment? That's awfully hard to do. Will the student record it, and will you look at that recording and give a grade at a later time? Maybe you'll do a mix of both. I've done that before where I've graded in person and I've gone back and looked at a recording to add. In this case, if you have a class of 40, you might think about how to utilize an ALT. So how would you maybe divide this assessment task between you and another teacher? Because it's a lot for one person. The next, I would think about the criteria that I want to use. So these are 5 that I often use. So fluency, meaning can they speak without stopping too much? Or are they stopping a lot because they're trying to retrieve information? Comprehensibility. So within this, you might think of pronunciation. You might also think of accent. Some people like to talk about accent and getting rid of the accent. I think accents are great. I don't think accents are a problem at all. What is a problem is if their speech is not comprehensible, if you can't understand their speech because of pronunciation or something else. So really the focus is, can you understand them? Not is their speech perfectly without an accent or anything like that. So can you understand it? And then grammar. And I really like to think about, are any mistakes keeping you from understanding what they're saying? And then organization. It's so easy, it's much easier in writing to organize your thoughts, but it's much harder in speaking. So are they able to organize their thoughts when they speak? Or is it kind of a mix of incoherent ideas that don't go together? And then vocabulary. Did they use appropriate vocabulary? Did they use the same words over and over again, which tells me they don't have enough to really talk about this topic? So these are 5 that I sometimes choose from. So let's go to the next slide and look at a rubric that I created for this A1 objective. So I have 4 factors here: fluency, comprehensibility, vocabulary, and grammar. I didn't choose organization because this is such a basic objective. There's not a lot to organize. It's pretty much straightforward. So I have 5 to 1, 5 is strong. So if you look across the board, fluency is smooth with few hesitations. It's very comprehensible, very clear and easy to understand. Excellent control of wide range of basic phrases. Excellent grammar control. Structures are used accurately. And then it goes down. I mean, 3 is in the middle, it's pretty average, and then we get down to 1, which is they're really struggling. This PowerPoint will be posted later, so you can go back and read all of these things. But of course, your rubric will look different than mine because your students are different than mine. But this is an idea of how I would do it and how I would arrange it. So what I would do is I would give this back to the student after I've graded them, and I would circle or highlight the areas that they got. So maybe they were a 3 in fluency, and so I highlight that. Maybe they were a 4 in comprehensibility and so forth. So students can see exactly what they got in each section. So let's think more about our rubric and what we need to think about in the next slide. So first of all, the first consideration, it needs to be easily understood by students. The goal or the task is not for students to understand the English in the rubric. The goal is that they do the speaking task well. So you might consider providing the rubric in Japanese, or at least have a Japanese version that you show them at some point, because they just need to understand it. They don't need to be able to understand it in English. So that would be my first recommendation. The next thing to consider is that you need to spend time teaching the rubric. So I always spend time in my class explaining the rubric, going through the different sections and explaining what is expected. So spend time, because that shows the students that this is important. And then, when possible, give them a model of what a high rubric score would sound like. It's always helpful to give them a model if possible. And then, so what I like about highlighting, like if they got a 3 in fluency and a 4 in comprehensibility, students need to understand where and how they will improve. So if they are a 3 in fluency, they know what they need to do to get up to a 4. They know the direction they need to go in. Okay, so that helps with that. And to go along with that, students need to be given a chance to discuss their performance based on the rubric. Students worldwide are all the same. When you give them back their score, their rubric, what's the first thing they look at? The grade. They want to know their grade. And often they would look at their grade, either they're happy or they're unhappy, and they move on. And they don't look at the feedback of what they did in each section. So what I started doing with my students is giving them a chance to talk about it. So they could do it in person. I like to do it online. So I did mine on a voice thread, which is a digital platform where they can record themselves. And then they were able to tell me, or the task was, what did you do well? What did you struggle with? So that way, it's a task for them to think through how they did, so that they don't just look at the grade and move on, so they can make a plan moving forward. So I would consider these things when you're thinking about your rubric. Next. All right, so let's get into some speaking, and let's start with young learners, because I know that that's where a lot of the changes have happened to add more speaking early on in elementary. And I know that this is such a struggle. I've been in elementaries in Japan, and teachers have a lot to do and not a lot of time. So they might have just one class period in a week, and that's not a lot. So I know how difficult it is for elementary school teachers. But here I hope are some suggestions. So next. Your goal should be to put the students at ease, because my guess is that some are nervous. But the flip side is that some elementary students have no fear. So maybe you're getting them early enough that they're bold and they haven't learned to be afraid. So a lot of teachers in Japan told me they start to be afraid around 5th grade. So again, it just depends on your students. But again, I would start slowly, incrementally. Start with the basics and try to be as repetitive as you can and give them as much practice as you can in your limited time. So one thing that I would urge you to do is number 3, to utilize English partners in your building. And what do I mean by that? So I went to a few elementary schools that I was really impressed with when I was in Japan. The last one I visited was in Western Tokyo. And I walked into the building and there was English everywhere, on steps, on signs, everywhere. And the administrators, the principals, the teachers, the people who worked to make the lunch, everyone was in an English-friendly environment. So even though not everyone spoke English well, they were on board to help students with English so that it was all around them. And so if there are other people in your building that feel comfortable with English, that can greet students in the morning when they come in and say, "Good morning, how are you?" And then at the end of the day, they could say, "See you tomorrow, have a good evening," or something like that. Then it's not just only on that 1 hour of English with the English teacher a week. So if there's any way that other people in an elementary building could also jump in, I also have an idea that if gym teachers, PE teachers could take part. When students are moving their bodies, they're not thinking about whether they're saying the right thing. And so you could give directions like throw the ball, throw it back, or whatever you do in gym. So find other people in your building that could be partners. And then I would urge you to use technology when you can, even for the young learners. The young ones, they know how to use technology. And it's a great way for them to practice speaking without people around. So then they could practice without embarrassment. So these are a few ideas. So use sentence stems to support them as they practice. So instead of trying to come up with the whole thing on their own, give them the start of a sentence and have them, post it on the projector in the front. So I live in, my favorite animal is, or I feel happy when I am hungry, I. So these really help take some of the work out and they can ease them into speaking. So the next slide. So if you are not on Instagram as a teacher, I would urge you to get on Instagram because there is a wealth of ideas and information. And my colleague, Kim, is on Instagram at the ESL girl, and she just posted something 2 days ago about sentence stems on September 2nd. So I would encourage you to look at Instagram for ideas, and especially this one account. So start looking for resources there. Okay, so Kim had this other idea. I've seen it used many times. She has this great picture, is conversation starters. So to start or end a class, if you have 2 or 3 minutes, students could pick a stick or a paper out of a box, and it has a prompt. It can be general speaking or tied to whatever topic, like the weather, if you're talking about the weather, but it should be fun. So look at her picture. It says 1 minute talk, hair. So it's nothing, too academic or too serious, but just talk about hair for 1 minute. And hopefully students will find that to be fun. The other one that's sitting there is we use monkey in a sentence. That's it. So these are great things to do at the beginning or at the end, just to get students used to the practice of talking. Okay, next. Here's another idea if you have a dice, or you can even make a dice out of paper. So here's 2 different objectives. So the one on the left is ours that we've talked about, can say what the weather is like using basic phrases. So students get with a group and they throw the dice, and whatever number comes up, they have to use that word. It's very simple, but it's a little more fun just because they get to throw a die. The other one on the right can express immediate needs using simple language. So you might put 2 words next to a number and then they have to do it. So number 2, they'd have to add the S, she needs. So this is another idea of something you could do that's a little more fun with your students. Okay, let's move on. All right, so now we're getting into just general activities that you could use at many different ages. So the first way to speak is to speak to share. And so this is when they're sharing from their own life. And why this is good is because they know about their own life. They don't need to learn something to talk about it. So they're talking from their own experience. So if we look at the next slide, some ideas are show and tell. I did this with my university students a couple weeks ago, so there's no age limit to this. So you could have them bring something that is important to them and tell why it's important. You could have a question of the day. You could have interviews. Maybe they interview someone in their family, or they interview the principal of the school or whoever, or surveys. Next, click. So all of these ideas, they're non-threatening. So if you're looking for ways for students to ease into it for something that's not, focused on performance, these are good ideas because the goal is to produce language, to speak, to practice. And they also encourage critical thinking because there's no right or wrong answer. They're just sharing what they want. And so they get to create that. So that's also good for critical thinking. Okay, so the next is if you have something you want them to respond to. You've talked about something in your class and you want to engage them and ask them to respond. So one idea, next, is the think, pair, share. You maybe have heard of this. It's very common strategy. So next, click. Students are given time individually to think about their response. And then they pair up with another person and then they share their ideas with that person. It's very simple, but students should get used to think, pair, share. Okay, get in a think, pair. We're going to do a think, pair, share. That should become something that they automatically know because it's so useful and helpful. One alternative, in the next click, is to do a think, pair, square, share. So each partner, they talk to each other and then they join with another pair to form 4, so a square, and then they share again. So it's just giving them another chance to say what they first said to their partner. So again, it's just practice and practice. And then the last click, you can also choose to have someone in the group be the speaker and share what they said with the whole class. So there's variations here of how you could do this. Next. Okay, speed dating. I don't know if this is a thing in Japan, but this is a thing in the United States, speed dating. So you go to an event and you sit with someone and you talk to them for maybe 5 minutes and then you talk to another person. And so by the end of the night, you've talked to all of these people and then you know who you want to go on a date with. So that's why it's called speed dating. If you don't want to call it speed dating with your students, one other name is inside outside. So what you do is you arrange seats so that students are facing each other. Or for inside outside, you have a circle in the middle and a circle on the outside that moves. So you give students a topic and a time limit. You could start, if they're really not comfortable speaking, you could start small with 30 seconds or less, whatever you think is a good time limit. They discuss with their partner. Okay, next. When the time is up, they move. And so they're always talking to someone new. Same topic, but they're doing it with a new person. And so you'll have different things to talk about with a new person. So next, the benefit is students get the practice they need using structures and vocabulary over and over again because they need that practice. So that is the speed dating technique. Okay, next, we have the speaking journal. So you may be familiar or you may use written journals in your teaching. This is an alternative to that with speaking. So you need to find an online platform that works for you and works for your school. Flipgrid or VoiceThread, Google Drive, OneDrive, whatever it is. Assign a weekly speaking journal assignment where students respond orally to a prompt. Set a time requirement, whatever it is that you want. You could give them a list of suggested topics. So I give my students a list, a whole long list at the beginning of the semester or the year, and they can just go back to that repeatedly and find a new topic. So what I like about this is that, again, they're just talking. They're not worrying about if they're saying it correctly. It's just that practice, that weekly practice. And they're also doing it with just you listening. They're not doing it in front of other people. So hopefully it can increase their confidence. So some ideas: what's your favorite Japanese holiday? Is summer better than winter? What's your morning routine? Try to make them fun for your students. You know your students better than I do. But next slide. So when you grade for this, it's quick grading. Did they speak for the right amount of time? And did they respond appropriately? So if you ask them, what is your favorite Japanese holiday? And they talk about their favorite sumo wrestler, then that wasn't on topic. So those are the only things I would grade for. Again, you're giving them opportunities to talk. Okay, next. And of course, open-ended questions are so important in a response to something, a reading or a video. What did you think about? Why do you think this happened? Or blah, blah, blah. What would you have done if you were that person? In your own words, what was the point of the story? Do you agree or disagree, or why? These are excellent, if you do the next click, for critical thinking. So everyone always asks, how do you incorporate critical thinking? It's these small choices. So adding a couple of open-ended questions helps students to think critically, to apply what they've read, and to think about it and to make a response. So this is an excellent way to get them to respond. Okay, and then the last one, I know we're almost out of time, is speak to understand. I love this one. So next slide. So I love the jigsaw. I've used it so many times in my own teaching. So they have a reading that's new for them. And I divided it into 4. Let's say I had 16 students. I know that you have bigger classes than this, but for our example, I divided it into 4. So you have a reading in 4 parts. You break the class into 4 groups. Each group is given 1 part. They read it, then they discuss it together to make sure they understand it. Then those groups move into other groups and they explain it to their new group members. So let me show you how this works in the next slide. Okay, so I have 4 parts, I have 4 groups. So group 1, together, they read and talk about section 1. Group 2 does section 2 and so on. So they really make sure they understand that 1 part. Next, I split them up so that 1, 2, 3, and 4, they're now together. So the 1s teach 2, 3, 4 their section. The 2s teach the others their section, and so on. So by the end, everyone now has a good summary of what the reading was about. And as we know, when you teach something, you learn it. So students are interacting with the material in a new way. And so I found this to be so helpful and useful. I love the jigsaw, so I would encourage you to try it and see if it might work for you. Okay, and you could also do it in breakout rooms. It's a little harder, but you could put them in a breakout room and then reassign their groups. You have to do it manually, which is a little cumbersome, but it can be done. All right, so I think we're coming to the end. So to sum up, know where your students are and plan from there. Next, find a variety of ways. Don't always do the same thing. Try to change what you're doing for them to engage authentically. And then create chances for a lot of practice. They need the practice, and I know it's difficult if you don't have a lot of time, but try your best to create those chances for a lot of practice. Okay, so now it is time for questions and answers, Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom and not the chat box, the Q&A box. And please make sure it's addressed to everyone. And also, please write your questions in English. My Japanese is terrible, so please write it in English. Okay, so thank you very much for your talk. I often assess students' presentation with the rubric evaluation paper. In order to assess students' delivery, including eye contact, posture, gesture, I often struggle with assessing the appropriate evaluations. Do I have suggestions for creating a better rubric for the delivery? I guess my question is, where do you find the struggle? That would be my question. Eye contact is what I look for is eye contact and also scanning the room so that you're not just looking at one person, but you're moving your room. And I also look at what they're doing with their hands. And so I do some practice ahead of time. I show them a video of what I expect. And so I think the rubric is good, but I think it's also how you teach the rubric ahead of time that could maybe help with that. Could you give me more ideas of speaking activities for online classes? So a lot of those things that I did can be done online. So it depends on what you're using and how you're utilizing breakout rooms. So I love actually teaching online. I didn't think I would, but I do. And so I use it for breaking people into groups. And I also use collaborative documents like a Google Doc or OneNote for them to talk about things and then put them in a chart. So they have to talk together about what they're going to put in a document. So I do that. Flipgrid, I would try that. That is a great tool for getting students to speak. So I would try Flipgrid. I would just try breaking students into groups and doing some of the things I suggested on Zoom in a breakout room. So I would suggest that. Japanese people tend to be shy, especially teenagers. What do you do when they all fall silent? That is an excellent question. So that's when I would break them into groups. And so if they're in smaller groups, then maybe they'll be more willing and they're doing it on an online app so that they're getting more confident with doing that. And then if they don't like to talk in the group, I would just do a lot of smaller groups and try to get them. I hope my internet's okay. I think I just got a notice it was unstable. In Jigsaw, do you have any idea how to avoid students speaking Japanese too much? So that's when you circulate, and if you have an ALT, you're all circulating. And so, you know, I think some Japanese is okay, especially if they're trying to figure out language, but that's when I would just circulate and just, you know, gently encourage them, let's speak in English. So that's how I would do that. So you're always moving around. And that's why if you have an ALT, use them for this, definitely. How to correct Japanese students, is recast better? Again, it depends on your students, and it depends on how comfortable they are with correction. So I love the recasting, I really do, because it's the most subtle. And so you're just kind of doing it in your flow, and you're not spending a lot of time focusing on it. So I think that's a great one. And like I mentioned in my presentation, if you don't even want to do that, keep a note mentally of the mistakes and address it to everyone and say, I've heard a few people doing this. And so you're not actually focusing on a certain person. I would like to evaluate student speech regarding its content. Would you tell me how I can put content? So you need to decide exactly what specifically you're looking for content. So that's when the more specific you are, the better. So whether it is a formal presentation and you're looking for a topic sentence, or you're looking for transition markers, whatever it is, make it very explicit and put that in the rubric and teach it ahead of time and practice it so they know exactly what you're looking for. So determine what it is about content specifically that you want them to do. Okay, the information about Instagram, it will be, it's in my PowerPoint that will be posted, but use Instagram to find teachers to follow for ideas. The one that I mentioned was at the ESL Girl. She's another fellow with the State Department. She was in Africa. So that is one I would highly recommend. She has a lot of resources. Some you have to pay for, but a lot are also free. So I would do that. Do you think it's effective to have students practice talking, use a specific conversation pattern, especially for elementary? Yeah, that's the sentence stems. That's what I would use for elementary students when they're learning, and they don't have to think so much about the structure. They can really just try to be successful and practice speaking. So I do think it is important to have that scaffolding. And then as you move forward, if your students are doing well, you can change that so that they're not as, you have them do more. So you take some of the scaffolding away. So yes, I do think it's important. Okay, so how often do I show the rubric? So I have multiple rubrics. I have a different rubric for every assignment because each assignment is different. And so I show them the rubric at the beginning of that unit or when I'm introducing the assignment. So yeah, so I would do that because I don't just have one rubric for the whole year. It's always specific. So it's like right before they're doing the assignment, I would teach the rubric. Okay, can you tell us more about speaking journal? Do you give same journal to all the students or have them choose a journal topic? I think, what should we be aware of? So I always, any chance that I have to give students the choice to choose their topic, I would do that. If you are worried about them choosing an inappropriate topic, that's when you could just have a wide range of topics for them to choose from and say you have to choose one of these. If you do let them choose the journal topic by themselves, then I would give some guidelines. So what's inappropriate, what's what's okay, what's not okay. If you'd like to avoid that, just give them a really comprehensive list. Or what you can do is you could spend a day and create journal topics together. That could be fun. So they have input, and yet together you're creating them so you know that they're appropriate. So that's one idea that you could try. Yeah, so I know that this is happening. I've been talking with a colleague in Japan about this. Pair or group work is not allowed to do in the classroom. Do you have any speaking activities in which students can do individually during the class? So they can still, if I'm right, they can still speak. So I would just have them do like sentence stems, or like do, this is not ideal. This is not at all ideal, but I would just have them, you know, have a conversation with the teacher. So you do it all together. So good morning, how are you? And then you can maybe call on people. It's not ideal. I wish, if this is the scenario, Zoom is better, online is better than being in person. So I'm sorry that that's your situation now, because it's really challenging. So I would, or you could have them create a conversation, so they could write out the conversation in class and then they record it on some kind of app at home. That's what I would do, is I would utilize these online tools that they could do some learning in class, they could prepare in class, and then at home they can record it and they can get that practice that you can hear. So that would be a suggestion that I have for that. It's a very difficult situation. Yeah, so the question is, it takes a lot of time for teachers to listen to speaking journals. You don't have to listen every week. You can, you know, listen after a while, and, you know, they don't have to be long. They could be a minute each. So if you have 40 students, that's 40 minutes. And all you're listening for, they're actually kind of fun. You're listening for length of time and did they answer the question. So it's not labor intensive grading where you have to listen for, you know, grammar, is it correct or not? And you can also utilize your ALT if you have one. And so you can divide it that way. But like I said, you can maybe say, okay, I'm going to listen to these every once in a while. So you don't know when I'm going to check, but I'm going to be listening for these. So you don't have to do it every week. Okay, could you introduce me to another example of conducting a speaking activity or training online? So I could, the ones I gave today are some that can all be done online. So I would start there. You could do presentations online. Honestly, I know I keep saying it over and over again, Flipgrid is now where I think the future of speaking activities online is. It's so dynamic. And so if you can even just get ideas from Flipgrid, because they have a database of examples. You could do experiments. You could have them show you how they make their breakfast in the morning. So it's limitless what they can do with these apps like Flipgrid. So I would suggest looking into that. If not, you could just get ideas from them. Because they're really dynamic and really exciting, the things that you can find there. So I would suggest that. Okay, good speaking textbooks. I would look into anything by Pearson. I'm trying to think of other ones that I've used. Honestly, most of my speaking classes have been where I do my own. I create my own content, so I can't remember off the top of my head, but check into Pearson to their speaking line. I would recommend them. And also National Geographic, they have really great textbooks that use really dynamic videos. So the Nat Geo series is really dynamic as well. So check them out too. So those would be my suggestions. Okay, so I think that is it. We are right at 11 o'clock. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate your time.